My wife Cheryl and I have been together for 10 years, and we got married 2 years ago. We just got a house together not even a month ago, and things couldn't have started on a worse note. We moved to a small inland town of Georgia called Waycross. That's all the details I'm giving though, to avoid any more possible issues. We're on a quiet street with a big property that sits in front of a medium-sized patch of woods, which was one of the factors that really appealed to my wife and I. We plan to adopt a dog and raise kids here, so we wanted a big property for the dog and kids to play around on. We both work similar shifts. I get home around 5 and she gets home around 6 most of the time. The first 2 nights in the house went completely normal. It was the weekend, so we spent our entire days unpacking. It wasn't until Monday night, when we were both in bed, only having turned the lights out maybe 20 minutes ago, that outside from the backyard, there was the sound of this blasting music. Our nearest neighbors on either side were spaced out enough where we couldn't mistake music from their yards being in our yard. It was definitely in our backyard, and it wasn't party music or anything like that. It sounded like very old, staticky, vintage music. The windows were shut, so after my wife and I exchanged horrified glances at each other and wondered where the music could be coming from, I opened my window on my side of the bed, and it was much clearer. There was some song that sounded like it was from the 1940s or something blasting. I later found out after looking up the lyrics that the song name was Who's Afraid of the Big Bad Wolf by Henry Hall. It has a slight eerie vibe to it for some reason, even though it was meant to be a happy song. But at the time of listening to it coming from our backyard, it was nothing but downright horrifying. We were still learning the house, but we figured there must be a backyard light switch downstairs. I ran downstairs to the back door and flicked the light switches next to the door, and one of them turned on the backyard lights. I didn't see anyone in the backyard. I opened the door, and the music was louder obviously, but as I walked out into the grass, I realized it wasn't coming from the backyard, rather from the woods. The song played to completion as I was outside in the yard just standing there looking around. When the song ended, there was silence again. It seemed like someone must have been playing some stupid housewarming prank, but it wasn't appreciated. I went back to my wife and told her it was probably just some kids trying to scare the new ones in town for whatever reason. Hearing myself even say that, I realized how stupid and weird it sounded. Why would anyone do that? The next night, it happened again. A few minutes after we turned out the lights in the bedroom, music from outside started blasting. This time much louder, and the song playing was that song everyone's heard, Tiptoe Through the Tulips. Cheryl and I once again looked at each other, this time in genuine disgust and worry, because we had hoped it was just going to be a one-time thing, but it was happening again. I looked out the window, and this time I could see something on the grass. It wasn't a person, but there was definitely something out there. I told my wife I was going to check it out. She said we should just call the cops, and I said yeah, we will in a second. I went out there with this mindset that I need to establish I'm the man of the house, not just to my wife, but to whoever was thinking they could mess with us just for being the new people in the block. When I was in the yard, I saw the object in the grass was smaller than I had thought, but the blaring, creepy song was coming from it. I realized it was an old radio. I turned it off and looked up at the window at my wife who was watching, and I held it up, yelling that someone left it there to scare us with the music. What she did next was not something I expected in response to that. She started screaming my name to run inside. She kept screaming, "Run." I yelled, "Why?" And she screamed back, "There's people standing behind you." This statement made my heart skip a beat, and I turned around to face the woods. I saw 3 figures standing like 6 feet apart from each other, clearly facing my direction. They weren't running at me, they were just standing there. I yelled, "Oh shit," and ran back inside the house, slamming the door behind me. My wife was upstairs, hysterical, crying already. I told her I'd call the cops, and I did. They arrived thankfully not that long after. All the while, we were scared to hear knocks at one of the doors or windows. My wife and I desperately explained the situation to both of the police that arrived, and I showed them the radio on the ground. I asked them if they could take it back with them as evidence for prints, and told them I only touched the top part with the handle. They did take the radio. They also checked the front of the woods with their flashlights for a few minutes, probably just as a deterrent to the people in the woods to stop their behavior if they were still there. When the police left, honestly, we went right back to feeling vulnerable and scared, but thank Christ the people never returned. This was only a few weeks ago though. God forbid they came back, I'd try to get it on video. Back before my girlfriend Jenny and I officially started dating, we would still hang out all the time. We both snowboard, and her family has a little cabin-type house in Vermont not far from Stowe Mountain Resort. This was around our maybe 10th time hanging out. She invited me to go up there for a weekend with her to go snowboarding for the first time together. It was like a 5-hour drive. As we neared her little house, we spent about half an hour on this very windy, secluded road on which we'd pass occasional driveways that would lead up into properties blocked off by walls of trees. We were way up there in the mountains. The sight of other cars by this point was something to behold. It really felt like we were alone up there. A lot of the driveways didn't even have tire marks in the snow, meaning even a lot of the houses were void of people. Jenny told me that's because a lot of the houses here were owned by people out of state, just like her situation. I was going like 30 when she yelled at me to slow down, it's coming up, so I hit the brakes, and this little opening in the trees that I otherwise would have missed came up. We drove this narrow trail in 4-wheel drive, which led to this small house covered in snow. It looked incredibly cozy. We parked, and first thing we did was turn the heat on in the little house. We unloaded our stuff inside, and since it was already getting dark that night, we just cooked some of the food we packed for dinner and watched a movie. Pursuit of Happiness, actually. So the house had just about everything, heat, electricity, except running water. Her family had jugs and jugs of water for important things like washing hands and plates and stuff. But there was no working toilet, so she told me we had to use the outhouse outside. I only had to go pee that night, so I just went out to the front deck and peed into the snow. It was also snowing out that night. We fell asleep at some point during the second movie we watched, and we woke up pretty early to our phone alarms. We wanted the freshies on the mountain. We started getting ready to drive up to the ski resort. After breakfast, I had to go out to the outhouse though. I ran out to the outhouse in my shoes, and my feet started to freeze. On my way to the outhouse though, I saw footprints in the snow. They were kind of big, but I couldn't tell if they were boot marks or animal prints. I followed the trail, and it actually wrapped around the house and then went into the woods. I called Jenny outside, and she came to look and said it was probably a black bear since they're everywhere up here. So I went, did my business, and we set off to the ski resort, where we had a good 8-hour run. Afterwards, we stopped at a diner to eat, and then went back to the house. By this point, it was pitch black outside and snowing again. We set up a fire and got the heat on full blast and started blasting some music. We started to drink, and eventually I had to break the seal and pee. But also, if I was throwing my boots on anyway, I figured I'd do all my business in the outhouse. I ran out into the snowstorm and to the outhouse once more. This time I slammed the door shut to prevent snow and cold air blowing in my face. I heard the blasting music from inside the house still, but then over that, I heard the crunching sound of footsteps in the snow, passing the outhouse. "Jenny?" I yelled. No answer. The footsteps just walked away. I brought my phone with me, so I just texted her, "Are you outside?" It didn't immediately deliver though, because my cell reception sucked up there. A few minutes passed and I was still in the outhouse. I was just about to finish when the blasting music suddenly stopped. It was just pure silence, minus the sound of snowflakes hitting the ground outside. As soon as I stepped out of the outhouse, I realized it was pitch black out here now. The lights from the house were off. I figured maybe the power went out. I used my phone's flashlight and noticed a fresh pair of footsteps in the snow leading to the house. I followed the footsteps to the front door, where they seemed to stop, then continue around the house. I banged on the door and yelled Jenny's name. Suddenly the door opened and an arm pulled me inside the house. It was Jenny. She slammed the door shut and locked it. She whispered that there was a man who tried to open the door, which she locked as soon as I went to the outhouse because she was scared being alone. When she saw the person at the door wasn't me, she cut the power and hid in a corner in the living room and watched in horror as a stranger walked past the living room window slowly, looking inside. I came to the door only a couple minutes after this happened. Jenny told me about the secret cellar in the floor that her dad kept a couple rifles and shotgun in. Navigating in the dark, I found the handle to it and lifted it open. Now using my flashlight, I climbed down the little ladder and grabbed one of the guns off the wall. We then waited on the couch in the dark, afraid to turn the lights back on, exposing ourselves to whoever was out there. The closest neighbors were not a short walk. Jenny said it wouldn't have been any of them, and odds are they weren't even in Vermont right now. Once again, the only sound was the sound of snowflakes hitting the ground outside, until the sickening sound of footsteps in the snow outside returned. I took the loaded gun and marched to the front door, opened it, and shot like 3 rounds into the air, screaming. The footstep sounds were gone. I I'd imagine they ran off and the sound of the shots echoing into the air masked the sound of the footsteps running away. We left the next morning under the recommendation of her father, who said it's best to not be there at the moment. They don't really have anything they're worried about being stolen, so we just got the hell out of there the next day. At least we got our full day of snowboarding in. That horrific night was definitely an experience, to say the least. I've worked as a nurse in multiple hospitals and facilities. Before the current hospital I work at, I worked at a geriatric hospital 30 minutes from my house. I had experience working with older patients before, so this was nothing new to me. I had been working at this hospital for only a couple of weeks, and you'll soon understand why. This was on my second to last shift at this hospital, unbeknownst to me at the start of that night. I was working the graveyard shift, and I was running on negative hours of sleep. I was assigned to the Alzheimer's ward. The patients in this ward absolutely adored me. My presence as a young girl in her 20s among the residents of this ward who were otherwise left to themselves to float around in their minds, I'm sure saw me as a breath of fresh air, someone who could tie them to the now or to the everyday. If you're just left to yourself, you can mentally go to other places, but with someone else in your space, you're tied to that moment in time. I was dealing with a number of patients that night, but one was a little more restless than the others. Her name was Lena. This was my first night dealing with her, and she kept telling me anytime I'd enter her room about the voices she kept hearing and the man dressed in black she kept seeing in the corner of the room. The other lady in her room requested her curtain be closed before my shift started so that Lena would leave her alone. She was a sweet lady that smiled whenever I was around her, but she didn't say much and was very forgetful. Since I started my shift around 9 p.m., most of the patients were asleep by 11, but not Lena. Whenever she called me into the room, she'd be frightened of these alleged voices she was hearing, and the man in black that kept staring at her in the corner of the room. Not gonna lie, it was creeping me out a little. I believed that in her mind she was seeing and hearing these things, and I sympathized with her because I imagined them to be very scary. But still, I tried my best to calm her down and get her to go to sleep. I didn't want to turn on the TV to calm her down because I wanted to be courteous of the other patient in the room. I held Lena's hands and told her it's okay, to breathe and to relax. I reminded her that she wasn't here alone, and I was always just a call away. This seemed to do the trick. Lena relaxed for a while, and the next time I came in the room, she was asleep. Once most, if not all, of the patients are asleep, the night goes much slower. Time almost moves in reverse. An hour or two later, I was in the linen room stocking my cart when I heard something in the room. It was a relatively small, dead quiet room. I had the door closed too. That's why hearing another noise was weird. I turned, saw nothing, and resumed stocking my cart. Then I felt what I can only describe to be a hand on my shoulder. I looked at my shoulder, jumped, and screamed, but there was nothing on my shoulder. There was no one in the room. Yet I knew I felt something large basically grab my shoulder. I went out in the hall for a second to peek my head. No other nurses in sight. Dead quiet. I had nothing else to do but resume what I was doing. I continued stocking the cart until it was full. Then I turned to face the door, and I fell to the floor and started screaming as my heart was immediately in my throat. There was a man dressed in black standing outside the door, looking through the glass, smiling. My screams were loud enough to wake the entire ward. The man disappeared out of sight through the glass window of the door. Seconds later, the door opened and one of my fellow nurses came in to help me off the floor as I was hysterical. I asked her if she saw the man dressed in black. Her response was, "What man? There's no one else here." We checked all the rooms in the ward. There wasn't anybody dressed in black in there. My screams woke Lena from whatever light sleep she must have been in, and when I came into her room, she started talking of the voices. This time the screams, which she didn't know were my screams. I asked her what this man in black looked like, if he was smiling, and she looked at me, and I noticed her eyebrows point down as her expression changed to look the most focused I'd seen her the entire day. She asked, "How did you know?" And even with my heart still racing, I felt it skip a beat as she said this. She started screaming now, screaming, "Get me out of here, he's coming." The other nurses came in and tried to calm her down. I was switched to a different ward that night with someone else, and I eventually ended up going home early because I was just so freaked out. I texted the head nurse the next day that my next shift would be my last, that the experience traumatized me and that I didn't really want to be in that building anymore. I got as friendly of a response as I could have hoped for. I've never been diagnosed with anything, nor have I ever dealt with hallucinations of any kind. I'm aware of the effects of lack of sleep, but this was next level. I don't know if my mind started playing tricks on me from what Lena was telling me all night, but the feeling of the hand on my shoulder, the image of the smiling man behind the glass door, matching the description a patient kept giving multiple times. This was one of those once-in-a-lifetime, unexplainable supernatural occurrences. At least, I hope it was once in a lifetime.
There's one thing even more terrifying than these clips, and that's what your life would be like without watching more of our videos.